Hey guys, and welcome to another GameXplain discussion. I'm your host, Andre Seegers, and this time we're joined by Derek Bender, Ash Paulson, and special guest Colin McIsaac from Zelda Informer to discuss everything related to Zelda Wii U. So Colin, how about you give us a quick introduction to yourself?
Hey, so I'm Colin McIsaac. I am managing editor at Zelda Informer and editor-in-chief at Gamnesia.com. So I've been playing Zelda for as long as I can remember, and I'm super happy to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, I figured it'd be good to have someone from Zelda Informer on here, because you probably know a thing or two about Zelda.
Just a little bit.
Probably fill in a few gaps we may have here. So I guess we'll start off with our quick impressions of the trailer, because surprisingly enough, we haven't really talked about Zelda yet, despite it being one of the biggest games shown off during E3, during Nintendo's digital event. So let's go ahead and actually start off with you, Colin. What did you think upon seeing how Zelda looks on the Wii U for the first time?
I think it looks absolutely incredible. It was exactly the style that I was really, really hoping they would go for, and kind of skeptical that they would. And so the first time I saw it, I was just absolutely blown away and completely overjoyed. So
I loved how it was a bit of a slow burn, because at first you weren't sure you were going to get anything. It's just Aonuma standing in front of this apparently static screen, even though it really wasn't, just showing the breadth of the world. And it was sort of like just incredible to see just how much of it there was, because we've never had a Zelda world quite that big before, at least visually represented, where you can see everything. And then they go into that action scene showing off the new technology, the new enemy, and just the action of it. I felt like it was a really perfect teaser where you got a sense of what the world was going to be like, but also some of the action. It just felt really complete to me.
I'm right there with you, Derek. I thought the art style looks beautiful. The sense of scale is amazing, just from what little we saw. And I love it's very very kind of over the top anime like, the action with the giant lasers being fired by like the big robot walker type thing. And I think just the kind of the technology on display was kind of surprising and interesting for a Zelda game. So I'm super excited. I love the art style.
Yeah, you kind of hit it right there, Ash, with both the scale and the technology here. Where you can see, even though it was a mostly static screen, as Derek mentioned, there was still a lot actually happening. Like you could see like the blades of grass rustling in the wind. It just looked awesome, and that actually kind of added to the sense of scale too. And just with how far you can see in this world. There's
also, beyond the blades of grass, if you look really carefully, you can see sorts of like goats, other sorts of wildlife, birds, and even farmers, human farmers, in the background, and they all react dynamically to this big monster coming in, which I think is absolutely, fantastic. As far as breathing life into the world of Hyrule goes, it is the most believable Zelda world I think we've had so far, just from that little snippet.
It definitely seems to be that way. You mentioned how everything's reacting dynamically, and a ton of stuff is really going on here. Like when we were dissecting this for our analysis, just after E3, we spent hours just looking at the screenshot, or the opening scene of the trailer rather. Just breaking down everything that was happening, but a lot of it is super subtle. But there is a ton going on. It's just ridiculous, and it really does kind of like hint at just a scale of this game, not just in terms of like physical size, but in terms of attention to detail. But so one of the big things they seem to be doing with this game, though, is it is the scale of this world. Now Aonuma's been very careful not to use the word open world, it seems. But that is basically the essence of what they're going for, it looks like, where they are giving you this just gigantic, sandbox, for lack of a better word, this just huge area in which to explore. And he mentioned specifically during E3, like those mountains in the background, you can like walk to them. And in interviews that come out since, it sounds like you can go beyond those mountains and see like what's going on behind them, It just sounds intense. So what do you guys think about having, what do you take away from his comments regarding this? And what do you think, how do you think this might actually play in a Zelda game, like having a more open world style of gameplay?
So I think the really interesting thing about this is, especially because he's sort of dodging the term open world, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that gamers themselves, tend to define the phrase open world differently. So there's no real set industry standard for what open world means, and it's just kind of this vague accepted idea of how you play a game. And so in that sense, I think that it's, for lack of a better term, it's completely open world. Because you can go, really, it sounds anywhere you want. And he said, if you think you can just continue walking freely beyond the mountains, over the valleys, you'll just continue to walk until you're very far away. And in that sense, it sounds almost like the game is pretty boundless. And it's hard to think that they would fit meaningful content in an almost infinite world. So there's got to be some sense of limitations. But it nevertheless sounds like it is going to be this massive and very cohesive world where the mountains, where you can walk towards the mountains, and I'm assuming that what he means by that is you don't have a loading screen when you enter. Because, for example, in Ocarina of Time, as you go towards Kakariko Village, you have to wait for it to load Kakariko Village, and then it cuts out when you go to Death Mountain, you gotta load the mountain trail. And I think that what he's getting at is that those black screens that you have to wait through are no longer going to be there. And I think that's one of the most important keys to making this feel like a really natural sort of game.
They mentioned the original Legend of Zelda a lot during the presentation, and what they wanted to get back to as far as exploration is concerned, because there was really no guide for what you should do in Zelda. It's just like explore. It's like, here's the world, go explore it, see what you can find. And there's been, with each progressive game, there's been a lot more direction on where you should go, what you should do, and whatnot. But finding everything without a guide in that game is really dang hard. I mean, you gotta okay, I'm gonna burn this bush. Nothing happened. Okay, I'm gonna burn this bush. Okay, nothing happened. And keep just going down the line. And I get the sense that they want to try to do something like that with just a little bit like a visual hints, but maybe, the visual hints, of course, have been shown okay, this wall has a crack into it. I could probably bomb it. Maybe not quite something as detailed as that, but still the sense that, okay, I see that mountain in the distance. I'm going to go explore that mountain and see what I can find, because one of the core ideas of Zelda, at least when Miyamoto was first creating it, was inspired by his walks as a kid, just exploring caves and whatnot, and that sense of discovery and adventure. And I think if they're trying to do that for this 3D era and seeing just okay, I'm Link, I want to go out and explore and see what's over there and maybe get a reward, and that's a really admirable thing to try to do. The question I have is whether or not it's going to be rewarding you each time. Are you going to get rewarded with a rupee? Are you going to get rewarded with a special item, some sort of crafting material? What are they going to do to try to encourage you to do that? It's almost kind of nice to have a reward to do that, but then you could get into games like Shadow of the Colossus, where there is this huge world, but the only thing there is to do, other than try to find bugs that increase your stamina a little bit, or was it health, all you had to do was just fight the monsters. So is it going to be more like Shadow of the Colossus, where it's just a big world with lots to explore and see, but no real reward? Or is it going to be more like a modern game where, okay, you found this cave, you explored this cave, have some treasure?
I'm not sure why you mentioned Shadow of the Colossus when you could just mention Twilight Princess.
That's what I was going to say, actually.
I guess, yeah, that is the interesting thing here, though, is how are they going to, make this presumably gigantic world. I mean, it looks pretty big here, certainly, and make it engaging the whole way through. Part of the reason why, Link to the Past is one of my favorite Zelda games, I guess you could say it about Majora's Mask 2, which is also one of my favorite games, is there's such a density in that world, or even the original Zelda NES, as you guys mentioned. There's so much to do in those games, that even though the worlds themselves may not have been gigantic, it still felt like the scale still felt impressive simply because of how much there was to do. Whereas when you take a game like Twilight Princess, where you have to traverse this gigantic world, and there is comparatively nothing to do. You're just going point to point, to fill in the story beats, and that's it. It just felt like you were killing time, basically.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I mean, Twilight Princess kind of showed us that when you have a giant open world, but you don't really fill it with a whole lot, it doesn't really amount to much. And I don't see them making that same mistake with the Wii U version. I don't know. I mean, I'm of course excited for the game, but I get a little skittish with the term open world just because. And this may not be how a lot of people feel, but I actually kind of like some sort of overarching structure. I like linearity, not necessarily to the point where it's like a really rigid structure, but I'm not the biggest fan of open world games like Grand Theft Auto or Skyrim or things like that, just because when I have this giant open world at my fingertips and I don't really know which direction to go in first, I kind of just tend to not want to do anything. It's just kind of like it's almost like an embarrassment of riches. Like if I have too many choices and I just don't really want to choose anything, and I just end up kind of not really doing anything. And I don't want to see that happen with Zelda, just in terms of my own personal gaming tastes. And I don't know if I think it will. I mean, I don't see Zelda going the Skyrim route, so I don't necessarily think that that's what Aonuma is going for. But I don't know. I do hope there's still some sort of overarching structure. I know Ocarina of Time kind of had that where you could go where you wanted within reason, but you still had somewhere that you had to go before you could really continue. So I feel like it'll be a little more open world than that. But I have a hard time wrapping my head around the idea that if you just keep walking, you'll just go really far, far away, like what Aonuma said. So I don't know. I do hope, though, that they can strike a balance between being open world and free roaming and still having some sort of structure, so you don't just feel like you're out there completely, lost and doing whatever you want at all times. Because then I feel like there's a real fear that the narrative structure will break down, and I wouldn't want to see that happen in Zelda.
You brought up a couple of good points there.
Yeah, well said.
Oh, thank you.
Because, I mean, the lack of, or having too many choices actually, when it comes to like buying things, for instance, like it's been shown, you often make worse choices when you have too many choices. And you just kind of shut down, and I totally see where you're coming from, because I actually feel the same way about open world games. That's why I don't play Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption or Skyrim, which is probably the more one of the quintessential like examples of open world. And also for me, like too, because I tried playing Oblivion, and once I got out into the world, like it didn't feel like it was really designed. It just felt like they kind of threw things into places just to make it big, and I never really felt like I was exploring this intricate world. And I will say, at least based off what we've seen so far, I think it looks like Zelda Wii U is avoiding that. Like, it looks to have a pretty strong design based on this one area. I don't know if that's going to hold true or not. And there is something to be said for, having a linear experience too. I just feel like the more recent Zelda games, ignoring or putting aside between worlds, they've been far too linear. Like, it's been like you're on just a path, and there's not much room to stray from that. Whereas something like the original NES Zelda, you could go wherever you wanted at any time with very little direction. Whereas again, getting back to like Link to the Past, I thought it actually had a really good compromise, where there was a very clear structure through the game, but there were points in which you could stray from that. And I think they did something like that here. Like, where basically maybe there's like a suggested path, like a loosely suggested path, but maybe you can go off of that, and kind of make your own path if you want as well.
I think a really good compromise would be to take a sort of Mega Man approach, where you can beat the game really in any order, but there is one or two or even three suggested routes where you say beat the Water Temple before the Shadow Temple, before the Fire Temple, because say there's puzzles or bosses or enemies in there that getting items from other temples or from other places in the world would make easier, but still allowing players to go through each one of the landmarks at their own, on their own whim. And the trouble running into that would be designing the narrative around such a user-defined experience, because you can't really, you could say beat these three temples and then there's another major cutscene where a new part of the story is revealed, and then beat these three, but that's less meaningful to me than something that does have a linear narrative progression. And so that's the trouble, is trying to find the balance between open design and yet having a logical linear narrative that's really meaningful to the player.
Now, do you guys think they could take some lessons from A Link Between Worlds? Because as you were mentioning, Colin, the whole you can go in any order, but it might lessen the story. And I didn't really feel like that happened in Link Between Worlds, and that's maybe because there was minor stories involved with each dungeon, or at least it didn't appear as much. I wonder if they would choose to do sort of like a dynamic story. So okay, you beat this many dungeons and this cutscene is supposed to happen. If you beat it in this dungeon, the cutscene happens here. If you do it in this dungeon, that same cutscene happens, it's just the surrounding area is completely different. So make it a little bit more dynamic so that, you still have that player choice, but the story is still there to help you guide along. Now, that's a lot of extra work and probably not a guarantee that that'll actually happen, but it is an idea for how they could maybe structure this in order to give the players that freedom, but still guiding them along a path and giving them that story that people who want more linearity would enjoy.
Right, and I think that's an excellent compromise, actually. It's just I question whether or not they would want to put the extra time into doing that, and then how deeply that influences the way they design the rest of the game, and how linear the gameplay, because of another decision to keep the cutscenes in a set order.
One thing I think, is for sure, though, is that given kind of Aonuma and Miyamoto's kind of predisposition for gameplay before story, in I guess all of their games, but especially Zelda, whatever they do, they're going to design the game first and the gameplay and make the game they want to make, and then kind of implement the story around that. I don't think narrative is their first concern here, for better and worse. But another thing I was going to say was that it's not just the story I'm concerned about, really, it's also gameplay balance, because I loved The Link Between Worlds, and I talked about that, and I reviewed it for Game On. I loved it. But one of the few issues I had with it was that the gameplay balance, in terms of difficulty, was really all over the place, because the game had to be balanced to allow for the possibility of players taking on the low rule dungeons in any order, which meant that they were all kind of a similar challenge, and they were all pretty easy, I would say. And so there wasn't that kind of sense of increasing challenge, which I really like in a Zelda game, where you know that by the time you're at the end of Link to the Past in Turtle Rock, it's going to be a big challenge, as opposed to, the Eastern Palace from the beginning of the game. Whereas, when I played Link Between Worlds, I actually ended up doing Turtle Rock, I think, last. And it felt actually easier than the Thieves' Palace, I can't remember what it's called, the first dungeon I did in Link Between Worlds. And so there wasn't a real sense of actual gameplay balance there, or difficulty balance, because you can do the dungeons in any order you want. And I didn't really enjoy that, which is kind of what I mean by, I like having exploration and kind of non-linearity to a degree, but I still like having that overall structure where, there is kind of a somewhat set path to go on. And that's just because I think that when the developers know a player, or know the path a player is going to take, they can really kind of pinpoint and focus the game design around that.
Yeah, I just wonder if they're going to play with dungeons much, with how they'll function in this game. Because for me, and I realize I'm like the odd man out pretty much everywhere when this comes up. Dungeons are by far my least favorite part of most Zelda games. Every time I go to a dungeon, I'm like, I gotta deal with this thing now. Which is why Majora's Mask is one of my favorite games. There's only 4 dungeons, and most of the puzzles are built around, the process of getting to those dungeons. Which is something I actually enjoyed a lot more, and something Skyward Sword actually tried doing as well, in a little bit of a different way, by incorporating basically elemental puzzles into the game that preceded some of the dungeons, for instance. Basically, every area was like a mini dungeon. So do you guys have any ideas or expectations where you would want to see, either from dungeons or overworld puzzles of that sense?
I agree with you, Andre, that I actually do enjoy a lot of the dungeons in Zelda, but I did like that part, that element of Majora's Mask where, getting to the dungeons themselves was also a bit of a challenge and very dungeon-like in itself, but just kind of built into the overworld. So I'd like to see that return. But one thing I don't want to see return, and this doesn't necessarily have to do with the dungeons per se, but Skyward Sword's kind of sectioned off world design. That was one of my least favorite aspects of that game, and I like Skyward Sword to in other ways, but I really didn't like how the world didn't feel interconnected like Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask or Twilight Princess or especially the Wind Waker.
It was weird, right? It's
Yeah.
a game where you could fly anywhere, and yet you could barely take advantage of that.
Yeah, and I don't want to see that return. So at the very least, and it doesn't seem like it will because for whatever open world means to Aonuma, it's going to be a one big vast world. So I don't think that'll return. But I would love to see that kind of that dungeon-like overworld design return, where even getting to the dungeons is kind of a puzzle in itself.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree.
So when they first showed off, this new style of gameplay, or what seems to be, the thing that actually got me excited. Well, I was excited for two reasons. One is because it looks vastly different to what we've seen before. It doesn't really seem like they're doing some new stuff here. And two, I was just excited for what this could mean for exploration, because going around the world and exploring things is one of my favorite things to do in Zelda games. And it feels like something that's taken kind of a backseat in more recent games, partially because of how linear they are. You already know the main places you need to go to, and most of the things you can find, are things you don't necessarily even need. So I'm curious to see how they're going to handle, say, item acquisition in this game. Because we've already had, if you want to call it, like a more open type of gameplay in A Link Between Worlds, but that one just revolved around the central mechanic of having that item shop that you can visit and pick up items at any time. And I wasn't a fan of that. I didn't particularly like how that worked. It took away a lot of the exploration and feeling of reward you would get for finding something. So yeah, I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on, on what they might do here. Like, would you actually want to see a Link Between Worlds type of mechanic here, or would you want to see something new?
What I would really like to see is, and I think to an extent it's definitely going to happen, that this game goes back to the roots of the original Zelda a lot, because, I mean, Onuma's said it in basically every interview he's had, but is the idea that anything could be anywhere, and you don't really know if there's anything somewhere, if there's not. Little visual hints, like Derek mentioned it earlier, subtle visual hints that there's something going on would definitely help, because, for example, like burning the bushes in the original Zelda, you'd have no idea where to burn.
Right.
But, like, for example, in this big screenshot that we have of Zelda U, the one of the open Hyrule field with those rocks and the goats and everything, we don't know whether or not there's anything anywhere in that picture. For all we know, that could be, the village there could be it. Or for all we know, there could be a dungeon underneath every single one of those rocks.
Well, one of the ideas I had as you were talking about that is maybe not have... maybe you can keep the traditional items that you find in the dungeons to help you with the next dungeon or help you with that dungeon in particular. But I think maybe that what they could possibly do is for the like little secrets that you find hidden in the world, as you were saying, Colin, have it more be the items be more for about traversal or help furthering your exploration. Mm-hmm. For example, they could, I don't think we've ever seen the Rocks Cape in a 3D Zelda game.
Oh my god, that would be so cool.
Yeah, it'd be
my
awesome.
idea for it is, what if they could actually use that as a kind of glider?
Yeah,
and soar over this world and see where you can go and drop down, sort of like how the cape worked, or the whatever the scarf was in in
the
Skyward
loft
Sword
wing.
Ocarina of Time. Yeah, the loft wing.
Okay,
And, just soar over it and use a little thing, drop down, and you can parachute in. Use that to explore. Have the speed boots that you can run into things and explore that way. And sort of make the exploring helps you find more items that help you explore more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great point, because especially in a lot of recent Zelda games, like, for example, Twilight Princess, you have the ball and chain that's useful literally for the... I think just
temple,
for the
right?
the mini-boss fight in the Snow Point Temple, and nothing else. Yeah. And those are the kind of items, like, I think the ball and chain was a great idea if they could have just, used it more. But, once you've beaten that mini-boss, you essentially don't really have any reason to have the ball and chain at all anymore.
The items functioned as keys primarily in that game. You got an item simply to open the next area of the temple, and you never really need to use them again. And and that actually took away the reward of finding items anyway. It's like, oh great, I just found another key, basically.
Yeah.
So I imagine that's something that they, something I hope they work on in this game. I imagine they will. Basically they use those items as the keys to, for lack of a better word now, to exploring this world. Using those outside the context of just a temple, and opening up exploration based on that.
No, and I really like that idea. I think Derek Ojeda said that with the loft wing. I mean, that could be like, if you're going to have a somewhat open world design, that could be kind of the Zelda version of your own personal mount, where you call on your loft wing or something like that, and you can travel the world that much faster and explore, and then maybe depending on where you go, you can find things that can expand how far your loft wing or whatever else can fly. So then you can explore more of the world and go farther and farther, because maybe it's kind of like a natural limitation that if you have to walk somewhere, you're not going to want to as much because you're walking and it's slow. So in that way, they kind of naturally kind of limit where you can reasonably go, because you're going to not want to walk that far just because it takes so long. So if you can then work in other ways, such as expanding how far you can fly, or or whatever other modes of transportation you can get in the game, then it kind of expands the world in a natural way that way, even though you do technically have that freedom all along.
It actually sounds a lot like what the best Zelda game of the last 15 years did, was being Beyond Good and Evil.
Oh, shots fired.
where you would upgrade your craft throughout, and you could, at one point, like, jump over barriers that you couldn't, pass over before, and eventually that would culminate with a flying spaceship, or flying craft, where you could reach even more areas. And I loved that. I thought that was awesome. And that was another example of a world, actually, which wasn't huge, but was super dense with content, that it felt far bigger than it actually was, just because of how much there was to do.
Yeah. Well, we already see that to some degree with the fact that Link has a horse right away. He's not in his traditional outfit. He's in some sort of blue number, and he has a horse right away. And so I think that also allows the idea of exploring and seeing more. But when I didn't actually have the idea of a loft wing. I was actually thinking of the scarf that you use to land in so you don't fall to your death when I was saying that, but it's still a great idea as far as even being able to upgrade that item so you can just float farther or go farther, actually have some thrust or something to that degree that allows you to explore. Because for one, we got that one mountain in the overworld there where it's sort of split. You can see the waterfall going down. How the heck do you climb it? Well, you got to find, maybe we'll get some rock climbing gear or something to that effect, and ways to traverse these lands that we see, but it's not immediately obvious how to do it. When you look over there, you don't see a path winding around it, or even a bridge bridging the two mountains. So I do like the idea that maybe you can find some exploration items in order to do that. Now, whether or not they'll actually have it, that's really hard to say, and I'm the cynic in me says no, but I would like to see it.
I mean, just looking at this, at the field, it's just so rife with possibilities. Because, as I mentioned before, we spent hours breaking this image down, and we kept finding new things in the background that it just make me excited to see how this will work. Near the middle, in the back middle, kind of, you can see a temple type thing, emerging from a forest. Or of course, you look farther back, you see a volcano, which might be Death Mountain. And then there's a whole desert surrounding it, and it's whoa, how am I gonna traverse that desert to get to that mountain? It's really I don't think I've ever seen a single picture so filled with possibilities.
Yeah.
Like what they're doing with this, where it's sort of it is open. There is this sense of nature, but there's also this creeping sense of technology. But if you look, it's there's this very, very simplistic sense with Link and the things that are surrounding him. There's this it's just a simple wooden structure next to him, as sort of a lookout. So maybe Ganondorf, because he'll likely be the villain here,
get out
uses uses technology, and it's sort of you gotta, he's just much more technically advanced than Link and everybody else, so that's what bring the challenges, and maybe he's using it from this ancient technology that we saw hints of in Skyward Sword.
Well,
that's just me freeballing.
Well, there's this really actually interesting parallel I just thought of as you were saying this. If any of you have played Mother 3, I haven't done that. one of the themes of that game is sort of what happens to a small town that's very in touch with the natural world, and forests and just, community, and that whole sort of sense of old style living, I suppose you could say. What happens to a town when technology starts to become really prevalent and sort of starts to consume people's lives, and what happens when the little huts turn into houses and then turn into like buildings. And that's, I think, a really fascinating theme that they could do a lot with in Zelda. And I don't know if they're, playing around with that in Zelda U, but there is that giant robot thing that seems to clash with everything else we've seen in the trailer. So, who knows?
Not everything, because he does have blades of grass growing from him, or like moss or something.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I think actually is even more interesting, because it suggests that he's like a part of like an ancient technology or something.
Yeah, it could be that sort of, there was an advanced civilization that sort of crumbled, and then, a more old-fashioned sort of thing.
Well, I was going to say maybe it takes place. I mean, it takes place in a distant past, which just make me laugh because Zelda has kind of a thing about, okay, so here's the new beginning of the timeline. No, this is the new beginning.
Right.
So what if that giant robot actually is from the ancient civilization that we saw remnants of in the Lanayru Desert in Skyward Sword.
Right.
So we're actually going even further back in time, and now they're going to, pull a fast one on us and say, oh, Skyward Sword, that was, early in the timeline, but here's the true beginning. I would just laugh at that point. I'm like, okay, so this is where this is going. Okay.
Right. I've given up on even caring about the timeline.
We can't advance in any of the splits, so we're just going backwards.
I'm going to say right now, I don't think we're going to go before Skyward Sword with this one. I just don't, but we'll see. But no, I guess the one thing that sort of screws with my whole, Link and them don't have access to technology and whatnot is, of course, the bow and arrow.
Right.
Yeah.
Where he uses the really fancy arrow, which we have no idea. We just sort of guessed the idea that maybe he scrapped it from another one of these creatures that didn't become active later, and this one maybe he pops out and tries to attack him because he stole that piece of technology or something like that. But it's one of the things we got the most comments about in the analysis is the fact that we said that Link has no sword, and he just immediately goes to the bow. And if you look underneath the arrow, there is the sword.
Yep.
But there is still the idea that, okay, Link went for this bow before the sword. That's still kind of unusual for him. So, is there going to be a more emphasis on the bow, or is this just the fact that this arrow is the only thing that can take this thing down? And there is that whole question of what is combat going to be like with this game? Because we saw his horse lifting him up into this action shot with the bow and arrow, and I don't know. I'm very curious how they're going to treat combat in this one.
Well, along those lines, actually, yeah, I have no idea what they're going to do. But they have said before that they wanted to, shortly after Skyward Sword came out, I believe they said something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing here, that they couldn't imagine going back to, not using a Wii Remote as your sword. Not having that be the primary means of attack, like one-to-one sword combat. I was wondering what you guys thought about that, because even though they did state something along those lines, I feel like they're totally going to abandon that.
Yeah, they have a tendency, I think, to sort of backtrack on comments like that.
They do, right?
Because of where they are with the Wii U and with the GamePad, I don't think they're going to want to keep, emphasizing Wii Remote as a cool new technology, because they've said several times that, one of their biggest priorities as a company right now is to show people why the GamePad is important. Mm-hmm. And if they go back and have Zelda U's primary controller be the Wii Remote and Nunchuck, then that's completely backtracking on a huge portion of what they want to accomplish as a company right now.
I agree. That's a really good point. Unfortunately, I kind of agree, and I say unfortunately because it seems like people's opinion of Skyward Sword was directly correlated with with the experience they had with the motion control combat. Personally, I had zero problems. I know a lot of people out there had a lot of issues with it. I guess maybe it's an issue of setup, different setups. I had no problems, and the combat was by far my favorite part of Skyward Sword, but maybe besides the story. But I thought the combat was amazing, and after I finished Skyward Sword, I was like, man, I never want to go back to just pressing A to do a standard slash again. I want to have this kind of combat in every future console Zelda game from now on. But I also agree that they're not going to do that because they're so focused on the gamepad.
Right. So I actually, I didn't have any problems with this Skyward Sword combat either. But that said, I didn't love it as well. Like, I just went back to Skyward Sword a couple of days ago for our Hyrule Warriors analysis, so I could run around Skyloft and get footage of things I needed. And I was using the sword. I'm like, you know what? I really don't miss this. I really won't miss not having this. It was a good idea. I just didn't think it worked quite as well as I would have wanted it to. I mean, I didn't have any problems with it. I thought it worked fine for what Skyward Sword was, but I feel like they kind of exhausted, like, you know, they kind of played it out, and I'd much rather them
that may be too, yeah.
So I'd much rather them, see what they can do with the GamePad. And speaking of which, what do you think they can do with the GamePad? Because Colin did mention Wind Waker, and I thought, you know, I was one who didn't like Wind Waker originally, and I loved the remake, and I thought the GamePad worked brilliantly for it. With that said, I really hope they do more than just make it an elaborate map or item selection screen for this game.
So one of the cool things I think they could do with the gamepad, and again, this is sort of going into the one-to-one motion that Skyward Sword had, but to use the gamepad almost as a shield. And again, if, you know, it could have, different people could have problems if their setup is, you know, if there's too much light in the room. I don't really know the technology that can cause different problems with the gamepad, but say for example, instead of thrusting the nunchuck forward to do a shield bash, you could hold the gamepad in different like positions to block different attacks differently. And so say if someone is coming at you with a hook, like say there's a punching enemy and he throws a hook, if you could hold the gamepad like to your side to block him and then come at him directly, like in the middle or at the other side of his arm, you know, where he's not attacking you, then I think that could be a really, really cool way to improve combat.
It's an interesting idea, but I don't know if I like the idea of like I'm playing a game and I have to swing.
That's the other thing.
Input I'm using to swing around to my left side in order to block.
Oh, I didn't mean to swing around to the left, but rather to just sort of like move your hand over a little bit, and then. I don't know exactly how it would work. I'm not the designer, but something along those lines, I guess.
It still seems like Nintendo really hasn't emphasized the motion control functions of the gamepad too much outside of just camera control.
What are you talking about? Project Giant Robot, man.
I don't care.
But Colin, I actually agree with your shield idea, because I recall back at E3 2012 that before the Wii U came out, one of the tech demos they had was like this pirate ship game.
That became a game in Game & Wario.
Oh yeah, that was Game & Wario.
Oh, it did, didn't it? I forgot that it was implemented in the Game & Wario. Okay. Well, yeah, just I could see them going somewhere in that direction where you do kind of have to. You don't have to turn around all the way, but you do kind of use your shield or your gamepad as kind of an interactive shield to kind of, you know, block incoming arrows or or things of that nature from to the left or to the right of you or things like that. So I'm not sure. They would have to be careful not to make it feel too gimmicky. They would have to really work to make it feel like a natural extension of the game. Something I could see them doing with the gamepad is actually using the gamepad as kind of a different camera view for the action you're seeing on screen, which is also something they do in Game & Wario, which is it's I think that actually was a rumor that was circulating online for a while about Zelda Wii U, but that like perhaps the gamepad would show an overhead view of everything around you, whereas on the TV you're seeing the regular third person from behind Link's back view.
What do you guys think about how the game looks in general? Because it looks to me basically an evolution of the Skyward Sword art style. We can see like still some seemingly like toon shading almost on Link, reminiscent of Wind Waker. But again, it looks very much like Skyward Sword. So what do you guys think about this for his first true HD appearance?
I love it. I love it.
Wow.
It looks to me it actually looks more like an evolution of the Ocarina of Time art style, which was sort of it was realistic, but it was also very fantastical. It had these bright colors, and obviously the cell shading is reminiscent of Wind Waker and Skyward Sword. But I think the overall feeling to the world is very reminiscent, I think, of Hyrule Field from Ocarina of Time. It's very bright. There's clearly things going on. It's happy. I think it seems a little happy. We've got villagers and farmers and goats and all that fancy, fun stuff. It reminds me a lot of the beginning of Ocarina of Time when Link is a kid, And I think that it's just the perfect... I mean, I have a much longer winding theory about why this art style is, like, perfect for Zelda, but I'll spare you the details, because we don't want to get into a 2-hour video here.
No, I completely agree with Colin. This is a great art style. It looks fantastic, and as he said, it's very bright. It has a very soft look to it, which I really like to it. Like, this world's almost like, it makes the world seem much more inviting. But I like that they can spike it with danger, because the flames that pop up from the laser blast and just the pure power that's showing from those laser blasts give it a sense of danger. But overall, when you're just exploring, it's very soft, it's very light. But that's also presumably this is the beginning area of the game, so they can probably change how soft things look and make them look harder, more dangerous, and change the theming. And I think this art style will really work well for that sort of idea.
Right. Like, if you look at Ocarina of Time, Hyrule Castletown when you're a kid versus Hyrule Castletown when you're an adult, it has the same art style, but it's a completely different environment. And I think that this is the perfect art style to encapsulate that, to allow for those sorts of changes in the environment, where you can have this beautiful grassy field with flowers brimming with life, and sun, and, you know, just everything is wonderful. And then you can also, I think, this allows for those really, really dark sorts of haunting atmospheres as well.
I agree with you, Andre. I think it looks kind of like an evolution of Skyward Sword's art style. It looks almost painterly, and I love it. I mean, I can't really say a whole lot beyond that, but I love how colorful and vivid and bright the world is, and I tend to prefer games with a much brighter color palette anyway, so I say bring it on. I love what they're doing with it.
So do you guys have any final thoughts at all about this game? Anything you wanted to bring up, or any final closing thoughts that we haven't mentioned yet?
I am super excited. I'm a little skeptical. I don't want to get my hopes too high up, because obviously it's better to have low expectations and then be really pleasantly surprised, but I can't wait to see more of this.
We probably, it's a good idea, because, we don't want to, we speculated a lot here of what could be in there, and we don't want to get our hopes up too high, because if the ideas we have, we build it up in our heads, and if they don't have it, we'll get disappointed. Yeah. But I think, on the whole, the direction seems like it's going in the right place.
Sure. And I think if nothing else, I think one thing we can all be sure of is that when it comes out, it's immediately going to be hailed as like the best Zelda game ever, and then like a couple of years down the line, it's going to be like the worst one. So no matter what happens.
Alright, well I think that wraps up our Zelda Wii U discussion, so thanks guys for watching. If you liked our discussion, make sure to like and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at GameXplain, which you can find links to in the description below. And of course, check out everything that Colin McIsaac does over at Zelda Informer. Alright, well thanks for watching guys, and keep an eye on GameXplain.com for more. Bye.